Joining me now, CNN senior military analyst James Stavridis. He's the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, a retired four-star Navy admiral, a partner at the Carlyle Group, a global investment firm. He serves on the board of advisors for a handful of defense-related companies and is the author of a terrific book, The Restless Wave, a novel of the United States Navy. Admiral, I imagine you have seen many squabbles like this among world leaders and military leaders, but not on camera.
Yeah, you hit the right point. By the way, I agree with your analysis overall. I go back a decade ago when the NATO heads of state and government, including our President Barack Obama, who, by the way, his nickname was No Drama Obama, he knew enough to keep those kind of disagreements out of the photo spray at the top of the event. And he and other world leaders would go toe-to-toe with Hamid Karzai about how we were conducting the war in Afghanistan. Putting that all on display does neither side any good.
Can the European allies make up for a total collapse of U.S. support to Ukraine?
I think they can. It's a matter of will, not capacity, as follows. Europe's collective economy is 22% of the world's gross domestic product, just ahead of the United States at 25%. Really, Europe collectively and the U.S. are a matched pair of horses economically, pretty close. How big is Russia's economy? It's under 4%. So right out of the gates, the Europeans have 4 to 5 times more economic capacity. And how about military spending? Putin's spending about 150, 160 billion. Collectively, the Europeans, particularly now that their defense budgets are going up, are now approaching 4%, Michael. So certainly the capacity is there to do this. The question, which we'll learn more about this week, including tomorrow at a big meeting, we will learn more about the will that has to go alongside that capacity.
So read the tea leaves so far, because you know any number of European leaders have thus far voiced their standing with Ukraine in the aftermath of what transpired in the Oval Office yesterday. Any of that reaction noteworthy to Admiral James Stavridis?
Yeah, I think that the initial returns in the immediate aftermath of the bomb crater created by the meeting yesterday, the initial returns from the Europeans are sounding cautiously optimistic. I feel them starting to realize they're going to have to put the pack on here. Back to a wagon being pulled by 2 horses. If one of the horses just slips away, that other horse can keep pulling. You got to make sure it doesn't veer off in a bad direction as a result. It'll be led by Macron and Starmer, France and Britain. Look for the Poles to play an important role here. Look for the Baltics, who are small countries but mighty in their fear and detesting Russia. Look for the Swedes and the Finns, who have long bad history with Russia. I think there's plenty of will to go with that capacity. I think the Euros are going to step up here.
Okay, if the United States collapses its support for Ukraine, if it greatly diminishes what it's heretofore been doing for Ukraine, and if the Europeans don't fill the void, for how much longer can Ukraine hold out on the battlefield against Russia? How long can they go it alone?
They can't go it alone for any reasonable amount of time, but assuming the Europeans even continue their current level of aid, and let's do the numbers for a minute here. The U.S. thus far in 3 years has provided about 120 billion, call it 40 billion a year. The Europeans have provided in total all forms of aid well more than that, 160 to 180 billion. So there will still be a lot of capacity going toward Ukraine. I'm going to assume that'll continue and even go up on the European side. In that scenario, I think the Europeans backing to the Ukrainians, I think Zelensky can hold out for an indefinite period. If the U.S. remains engaged, back to your scenario, I think that Donald Trump then has a chance at cutting a deal. And if he really wants to cut a deal, he's going to have to maintain some level of aid, kind of park the animosity. And oh, by the way, I imagine if you asked President Trump, was that the toughest moment in a negotiation? I bet he's seen some moments a lot angrier and a lot more difficult than that and gone on to eventually cut a deal. The key is we got to stay in this. Otherwise, what I really worry about, Michael, is the knock-on effect on the NATO alliance.
I hope that President Trump's leadership gets us to the right place, and I'm trying to give him every benefit of the doubt. I just don't like the way it looked yesterday. It's not how you treat a friend, the way that I was raised. Thank you, Admiral Stavridis. I appreciate you as always.
My pleasure, Michael. And one last thought on the meeting. I think Zelensky should have used an interpreter. Trying to do it in English, although his English is reasonable, I think was a real handicap in those negotiations. Personality matters, communications matter.
Thank you, Admiral. Good to see you. By the way, to the Admiral's last point, I watched that interview with Brett Baer, who I have to say I thought did a terrific job, asked very direct and appropriate questions. But to the Admiral's point, in the Fox News interview, there was an interpreter out of camera shot. And on two, I think, occasions, President Zelensky just sort of paused, looked off to the stage. You could hear that audible voice. And so maybe some of this was lost in translation in the Oval Office.